Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Arianna Legovini. I am the founder and head of Development Impact Evaluation at the World Bank. I'm going to talk today about science for action, better evidence for better decisions in the DIME model. I developed the DIME model around 2005, and we have been implementing this model to take science to development practice. I want to start you off today with a very practical question from one of our case studies. And the question is, what would you do if you were to meet the Sustainable Development Goal number 3, which is to reduce by 50% mortality on the roads, in a situation in which you had very limited budget and no data to inform your decisions? What kind of infrastructure would you upgrade? Sidewalks, crosswalks, railings, lighting? Which behaviors would you need to enforce? Drunk driving, speeding, jaywalking? The issue of road safety has been put at the forefront of the development agenda. And during the recent Stockholm Agreement, we realized that the world had made very little progress on the issue of road safety and mortality on the road between 2010 and 2020. And the target was, the deadline for this target was moved to 2030. Now, in the DIME model, we start with the idea that we need to understand the problems that we're trying to solve in much greater level of details. In this case, working in the setting of Nairobi, we start wondering where and when do road crashes happen? Who's responsible for those road crashes? When do people die at impact, waiting for the ambulance, in transit? Do they die at the hospitals? Do they die at home from complications? The idea, especially in data-poor environments, is to innovate in measurement. In this case, we obtained access to paper records from the National Police Service of Kenya and digitized about 10,000 reports. The idea was to turn paper to a real-time map and start visualizing the problems and the locations at high risk, where the government could really invest in infrastructures and behavioral change. We then went to public data, especially to Twitter, where bystanders report events, including road accidents. And we innovated in machine learning algorithms to be able to report crashes in real time and turn Twitter reports into live mapping of crashes. The idea was to obtain a tool that would be useful for both prevention and response to mortality on the road. We further went to the high-risk locations around the city and conducted a very detailed survey of the infrastructures and even took recorded videos to understand the behavior of all users on those roads. We added Uber and Waze data on speeding, Google Maps, and weather data on land use and road conditions. The idea is to obtain a completely different data set and, in fact, a high-frequency data system that would allow us to analyze the data and turn the data into a policy tool. And so the question that I would like to ask my audience is, what proportion of the Nairobi 4,500 kilometers road network do you think hosts 50% of crashes, injuries, and death? And the surprising answer to that question is that only 200 locations in the city represent more than 50% of crashes and deaths. And those 200 locations only represent less than 1% of the road network. So the idea here is to basically use this mapping to turn an unmanageable problem into a problem that is now much more manageable. Fixing the infrastructure on 1% of the road network is clearly something more manageable than having to upgrade the infrastructure of a whole city. We further understand that 71% of the deaths were pedestrians, and of those, 41% died between 7 p.m. and midnight, highlighting the issues of lighting on the streets, speeding, drunk driving, and developing a better understanding of the factors behind the car crashes. The idea is then use the analysis to have a conversation with government regarding the package of interventions that could be applied to high-risk locations around the cities, then use science, specifically randomly assign the package of interventions in selected locations, as many as resources allowed, to measure the impact of this package on crashes and measure it against a control group that would allow us to assign causality between the interventions and the results on the ground. And then use the results of the study to negotiate additional resources and scale up the intervention to eventually reach the MDG 3 on road safety. So this is just an example of how we go about building data capabilities and then using rigorous research and science to inform a process, both to prioritize policymaking, but also to document the results of an intervention and gathers both political and financial support around its resolution. This example is part of a much larger program, which we call the iConnect program, which are field experiments and impact evaluation of large-scale infrastructure programs, innovating in partnership, data, and methods. This program builds data capabilities at both city, national level, and even cross-national level to understand the economic factors around the large investments in infrastructure. The idea behind DIME is to move development practice from what I would call expert advice to tested solution. And the idea is not for the World Bank or anyone else to do it for governments, but really to increase the capacity of governments and policymaking to understand the problem they are trying to solve, ask the most important questions, collect data and monitor implementations, and understand how to operationalize results of research and put it into action. The DIME model is based on the idea that we need to help release the constraints around adoption of evidence-informed policy. And what are some of those constraints? Of course, they are financial and technical, which we address by subsidizing research, helping to finance local knowledge generation, and then contribute to kind of the global public good and global knowledge, but also build the skills and capacities locally to accompany the process and adopt kind of a learning by doing approach that allows governments to learn how to develop data systems and use data for the purpose of informing policymaking. We also use group dynamics to secure greater adoption, especially across large research programs that include multiple countries and allow policymakers to partake of groups of practice and start learning more around the policies that they're most concerned about by having a larger group of people across many different countries that are thinking about the same issues and developing their own knowledge and understanding of what works in practice. We also think about the aspiration and reputational constraints. The reputational constraints mean that by documenting scientifically the successes of the approach, policymakers would be able to negotiate and gather political and financial support around their ideas. And one driving force, I think, that has generated a lot of demand from governments for our support has been really our kind of working on or inspiring policymakers to achieve more by providing a lot of support or providing to them a lot of support during the implementation, the design and implementation processes of their program, and help them use data and evidence systematically and iteratively to get us to greater results over time. So the DIME today is a global research program that implements research across all the sectors that the World Bank is supporting governments on. In the last 6 years of programming, we've been implementing a $200 million program that has helped shape and improve the delivery of about $20 billion in development finance across 62 countries, with more than 200 long-term collaborations with government agencies. And DIME today is a global leader in what I would call adaptive development research, and focused on 3 specific areas. One is data, innovating in measurement and building government capabilities to understand the problems they're trying to solve, using artificial intelligence and other analytical methods to find opportunities for targeting and prioritizing public resources and efforts, as well as conducting randomized experiments to improve outcomes and impact evaluations to evaluate and document success and create opportunities for scaling up programs that work. And so the question is, what can be expected from a DIME model of adaptive development research? And the first question that I've always been asked, will research slow down the implementation of my project or program? And so within the context of the World Bank, we have studied this issue and determined that the more intensive use of data and evidence within project implementation actually support the process of efficiency and implementing projects faster than the average project. And this is due mainly to issues of readiness and field capacity. By readiness, I mean when researchers work with implementing agencies to implement, to help them implement their projects, the level of readiness increases substantially. Scientists are very specific about setting protocols for the research, and so they'll need to know what, when, and where things need to happen, and support the process of preparation that is much deeper in detail. But of course, the most important question is not whether a project implements faster, but whether projects become more effective. And I think of it as kind of a decision tree process. And just like a tree kind of optimize the exposure of leaves to achieve greater exposure to light, projects as well need to understand how to take decisions over time along their decision trees to maximize outcomes over time. And so the questions that we ask is not really whether or not a project delivers, but how to optimize all aspects of project design, such as participation and adoption, targeting, use of information, pricing and incentives, and social norm. And so I'd like to give you a few examples of the type of questions that we ask in our research. The first is around the take-up. So most policymakers, when asked about their expectations on the offering of services to the population, they expect a long line of people taking up their services. But often the picture is more like a COVID stadium, half empty. And that, of course, will affect the success of any program. If we don't secure participation, the program will not deliver on its promises. And so in the case of Ghana, for example, a government project on tree planting targeted farmers for supporting a tree planting program. When we conducted research to understand the drivers of farmers' willingness to plant, we found that monetary incentives more than triplicated the number of farmers willing to plant trees. And when we discussed the results with the government, they were quite interested in introducing monetary incentives into their program. However, monetary incentives are expensive, so optimizing pricing within each program could be quite transformative in terms of delivering results. In this case, we used an auction to have farmers reveal their reservation wages, the wages at which they would agree to plant trees. And we were able to reprice the incentives to half of the original incentives, thus freeing half of the budget and allowing the program to double its size or its coverage across different communities. This action alone increased the effectiveness of the program by 70%. 70% is clearly a very large number and much larger than any costs that were associated with the underlying research. In cases where we have a lot of data, such as the Bogota Transmillennium system, we can analyze the pricing or fare policies of, for example, a transit system in great details. For example, in this example, we used 2,800 million records to understand the impact of a package of changes to public transport fares implemented in 2017 to improve financial sustainability of the Bogota transit system. And because of the merging of these data with socioeconomic data, we could also understand both from a geographic point of view and from a socioeconomic point of view what the impact of the changes in fares implied for the population. And for example, the decline, the increasing fares caused a decline in trips across all users. But because of the increase in the time in which ticket transfer could be used to use different portions of the transit system, that policy benefited the bottom 20% of the population disproportionately. But such once the kind of the analytical framework has been set up, we can now use these data to actually ask a somewhat different question, which is how would I price fares and transfer policy to both maximize the financial sustainability of the system as well as the welfare to the population in the city. Another example of optimizing design is targeting. We often think of targeting as the need to identify the most deserving population that should be targeted for a specific policy or program. But another way of looking at the question of targeting is how do we optimize the matching of the right policy instrument to the right populations? And what does that mean? It means to identify the populations that are most likely to benefit from a specific type of policy instrument. And to give you an example, this is an example that comes from Côte d'Ivoire, from a social protection program that provided cash for work to very vulnerable populations during a crisis. We see in the first bar in orange that the program was very successful at benefiting the populations. They benefited on average $35 per person relative to the control group. But what we understand through heterogeneous analysis is that women in those groups benefited almost twice as much as the average beneficiary. And that by retargeting the program specifically towards women who had much lower opportunities in the labor market, we could increase the impact of that program by 70%. Again, a very large impact on the ability of a social protection program to deliver on its promises. And so in other cases, we have seen kind of modalities of implementation of projects that get replicated from country to country and become very common delivery modalities. In this case, agricultural projects very often use demonstration plots to have farmers adopt new technology, new seeds, new fertilizers, new ways of new technology to increase productivity on their plots. And so we challenged the notion of a demonstration plot and implemented a 3-arm randomized controlled trial to test the possibility that kind of democratizing or self-demonstration would be more effective in having farmers adopt new technologies. And in this study in Bangladesh, we demonstrated that self-demonstration is 2 to 3 times more effective in increasing technology adoption than the original delivery of a single demonstration plot. This has implication, of course, for Bangladesh, but it is really to challenge the notion that some of our programs and policies and designs are kind of remain static in the way they're designed, and they are accepted because they have been implemented for so long by so many people that they seem reasonable. But in fact, by testing alternative modalities, we could increase technology adoption by a factor of 200%. Finally, I want to make a somewhat different point, which is that we have used data to inform regulatory processes. For example, in the case of Senegal, we digitize information from the commercial courts of Dakar to understand in a great level of detail why the judicial processes were so delayed. And we use the analysis to have a discussion with the Chief Justice on the design of a regulatory reform that would include deadlines for pretrial durations. And kind of no wonder, once the regulatory, given the fact that the regulatory reform was based on the analysis of the stumbling blocks for efficient delivery of justice, we found that the regulatory reform was actually very effective in reducing the number of days on pretrial duration. And that reduction was a 30% reduction, which was then used by the country to negotiate a better ranking in the doing business. This first initial experience with the justice sector kind of incentivized us to expand the program. We established a large program in data and evidence for justice reform, which leverages recent investments in electronic court filings and court management systems in the courts. And we are also leveraging innovations in artificial intelligence that are helping us transform unstructured text into data, into analyzable data. And we use the program to run law and development randomized control trials to identify ways to improve the efficiency of judicial function as well as the quality. For example, a lot of work is going into understanding bias in judicial processes, gender bias, ethnic biases, religious biases, etc. And then looking at the impact of more efficient judicial process on private sector growth. And the initial results from these analyses show that efficient justice is one important element in ensuring a growing private sector. The effects, in fact, are quite large. And so to summarize, kind of having a very intensive data and evidence approach attached to the development of policies and programs can have transformative effects on their effectiveness by both transforming the data environments for delivering these interventions, optimizing project designs, as well as informing regulatory reforms. By optimizing designs, we then secure success of our policies and programs. And so this is a summary result from a study in Afghanistan on targeting the ultra-poor, where the government implemented a complex intervention to release constraints to poverty reduction, targeting one of the most vulnerable group in the world, which are Afghani women, vulnerable Afghani women. And because of the support that we provided to the implementing agencies, we helped secure 100% compliance of this complex interventions onto vulnerable populations. And the program was extremely successful at increasing consumption by 30% and reducing poverty by 20 percentage points. These type of results, of course, would not have been possible without that level of compliance. And the results, of course, were quite surprising due to the fact that Afghanistan is a very fragile context, but very, very encouraging that such an approach could actually support the process of poverty reduction, even in a country at such level of fragility. So I'd like to conclude by saying that applying science to the development process can be quite transformative. That investing in data analytics, and impact evaluation has very high returns, especially when implemented in close collaboration with government agencies and building their capacity to incorporate these processes in the normal way of doing business. It both improves the efficiency in implementations, and also secures large increases in effectiveness at a relatively small cost. In our experience, less than 1%. We spend less than 1% of the value of the investment to increase the returns of those investments by very large margins. And so kind of generating scientific knowledge locally that then also contributes to the global knowledge. So I would really like to thank for the invitation today, and I hope that we would have some time for discussion. So thank you very much for the kind invitation. I cannot hear you speak for some reason.
Really? Do you hear us now?
Oh, now I can.
Perfect. Okay, we are okay with sound. Thank you very much for your presentation, and we have some time for the questions. So one of your focus area is to change global development policy. And does countries want to change this policy, and do they have an understanding why it is needed?
So my experience actually with government agencies has been extremely positive. On average, development banks are very focused on the design process, but governments do not receive a lot of support during the implementation phase. Now, as the private sector has shown, kind of using the intensive use of data and experimentation in the private sector has been used very widely to maximize profits. But in development practice, data and evidence has been used much less, in part because of lack of capacity, local capacities to generate the level of data and research necessary to actually guide those policies. When we offer these services to governments, the reaction is extremely positive because they see this as very much an implementation support, kind of helping them through all the stages and really being able to drive the process of achieving results, as opposed to kind of wait for results to perhaps happen or not. Yes. So we don't wait for many years to provide support, but kind of handhold the process all along.